clinical standpoint, we're learning that anxiety and depression come from the same part of the brain. They can be expressed similarly or at the same time. One may lead into the other one might strengthen the other one, but anxiety and depression often occur together. And so what is that feeling of being anxious and feeling really anxious? Most people at some point in their lives have felt a little bit of anxiety, and most people would describe that experience as maybe feeling uncomfortable and jittery, unable to relax, all of that kind of stuff. And to feel anxious, anxiety means to worry excessively, so to worry more than the situation warrants. And a lot of the time there's some physical symptoms that go along with that as well. Rapid heartbeat, some GI issues, also feelings of unreality, so that's like tunnel vision, feeling like you're outside of your body. All of those things can accompany anxiety. And that does not feel very good. That's a really uncomfortable experience for most people. And, typically most people have experienced anxiety, maybe on top of a tall building or before talking to a bunch of people in a huge room or something like that. And a lot of the time we feel anxious in the face of either our phobias or some sort of situation that's life-threatening, right? A life-threatening event. And that's normal. That is a normal anxiety response. We have evolved as human beings to have this surge of chemicals in our brain when something's, going wrong to signal something isn't right, take action. This isn't good. However, folks with anxiety have these surges of chemicals without the life-threatening event happening. Right? So that brain is signaled over and over, regardless of what's going on, and as if something horrible is actually happening. And the reason that's important is because our brain can't distinguish between what is actually a life-threatening event and what is something that I'm being signaled as a life-threatening event. To our brain, it's all the same thing. So folks with anxiety are constantly receiving that message that something isn't right, take action, you're not safe, we need to do something about this. It's called fight or flight. And that's exhausting. That's a really exhausting way to go about your life. That prevents us from having, healthy functioning, that prevents us from being present in our lives, which is not a good thing. It gets in the way of our relationships, our work, our passions, all of these kinds of things. And I know this because I have struggled immensely with anxiety. From about age 12, I've sort of had that brain signal going off all the time, regardless of what's going on, that something isn't right, you aren't safe. And so, again, it's when that situation does not warrant that response. And for me, that started happening following a traumatic hospital stay for me, but that's not always how that happens with some folks. For some folks, they've been conditioned by their environment to be really anxious. So things like my family life, what was going on, was there chaos in the home, how was that modeled to me? That can also happen as a reaction to an event, right? So a reaction to that hospital stay for me. And then for some folks, that anxiety just comes out of what feels like nowhere. And that starts to build and build until feeling anxious is now an automatic response. And when we're thinking about this in terms of what's going on in our brains, where the more we do something, the more a neural pathway is being created, and so that response becomes more automatic. So now I'm so used to being anxious that it comes easier to me, and I'm immediately feeling anxious all of the time. We also know that anxiety and depression are incredibly hereditary. So as I had mentioned, I am an art therapist, and art therapy is a modality of mental health treatment. And we focus in art therapy a lot on visual and tactile sensation. It relies pretty heavily on introspection, so for the client to be introspective, and then also metaphor. And there is this role of quietness that happens in an art therapy session, which is sort of my favorite thing about art therapy compared to traditional therapy, is that we spend a lot of time being quiet, which I think is really important because I think just as people we aren't quiet and we aren't comfortable being quiet enough. So in comparison to traditional talk therapy, art therapists are after the same goals, we're covering the same bases, but we're incorporating art making into our sessions, which really introduces this whole body experience. So we're using our bodies and our senses when we're engaging in art therapy. And this is incredibly beneficial for a number of reasons. By sort of removing this emphasis on talking and articulating that exists in a traditional talk therapy session, we are breaking down a barrier to someone's ability to communicate. All right? And so, for example, my client who is nonverbal can now express to me how they're feeling. That was something that I saw a lot at Hope Network when I was working with folks with a traumatic brain injury. They literally didn't have the ability to speak anymore, but by using art therapy, they can now communicate to me what's going on. This is also really beneficial when I'm working with my really pissed off, uncooperative teenage clients, right? Because they can come in and tell me with their body language and their choices what's going on. Because typically when someone like that is coming in, they're not going to sit down and tell you how their week was. And this is especially beneficial when I'm working with a client who is so debilitatingly anxious that she can barely sit in the room with me. Okay? So she firstly can come in and start to self-soothe through art making. She can be with herself and become present in the room and ground herself. And just in doing those few things, she's already taken the first steps towards communicating with me. And after she's comfortable, she and I can be introspective about that experience. And so today I'm going to be sharing my experience. I don't think it's wise to ever share the experience of somebody else. We can't truly know that. It's not our place. So today I'm going to be talking about what this has been like for me. So in art therapy, we engage in what I call mark making. Okay, so even though it's called art therapy, we're not creating big, wonderful pieces of artwork. We're not creating a lot of the things that we see in here today. We're doing more of some mark making, making marks on the page. So what this means is that my clients and I are not worried about technical skill. We're not worried about expensive materials, properly using materials, advancing our skills. That's not what we're focused on. We're simply using those art materials as a vehicle to communicate and to express what's going on. So we sort of have a color or a movement or a texture in our mind, and we do our best to get that onto the page. And today's images are going to reflect that today. So the best you can, try to take off that critic hat today, take off that artist eye hat, and try to focus on some different visual elements in these art pieces that we're going to look at. So this is an image that I created when I was feeling particularly anxious. And so if we had this in front of us, this is as tall as I am. So this is about 5 feet tall. And we can see a few different visual elements in this piece here. This figure appears to be alone, and it appears to be in pain if we're looking at the body language. So this image is sort of like this. Look at the color, the texture, the shape that exists. That was almost, is everybody awake now? Yeah, exactly. We planned that, so that's that feeling of anxiety, right? All right. So if we can take a look at the color and the texture and the shape of what's going on in this image, and then also the choices that the artist made when they were making this, right? So what materials did they use? How did they choose to use the space? We can see in this close-up one that there's some eyes that are on the back and the shoulder of this figure. And just by looking at it, we can almost imagine the type of care that was taken by the artist when they were making this. We can imagine the motion of the artist's body when they were making this and the pace at which they worked. So how fast this person made this piece. So the second one is another image that I created when I was feeling some panic. So again, take a look at the line work, the choices, imagine how quickly the artist worked, how hard or soft they were pressing down on those materials, the way that it's been smudged and where. And if you guys are artists, you can kind of pick up on a lot of these things, right? And then in this last image, we see that the artist chose to fill the entire page with color. And they chose to do that so much so that the figures are completely lost and obscured in this image. Now, to me, all three of these images communicate a great deal, and it is my role as an art therapist to begin to facilitate that conversation. And so what are these images telling us, right? Notice that we're not asking the artist directly, how are you feeling? How did you feel when you were making this? Why did you do that? We're shifting that focus over to how is the image feeling? What would it feel like to be inside of this landscape? What would it look like, smell like, feel like? And what is the artwork telling us? And that's a really important distinction when I'm sitting with somebody that is struggling and unsure as to whether or not to disclose how they're feeling or how to talk about it. So, having this piece of artwork in the room is almost like a third person in the session that can then be that figure to start that conversation going. And according to the artist that made these three things, I would say that my images are saying, I'm uncomfortable, I want to disappear, I don't want to be seen, I can't stop moving, right? Those are sort of the things I would assign to those images. And again, I feel comfortable speaking for these images because I'm the one that created them, but I know that when I'm with a client, the only person that can assign that meaning is the person that made it. So when I sit with someone, I'm really asking them to share their story, to stare at their story, dissect that story of feeling anxious. And feeling anxious is now sitting on the page, taking up space in the room, and the client has to sit inside of that feeling long enough to sense it visually and physically and colorfully and dive so deep inside of that sensation that they are then motivated to take action, motivated to create art. That's a really powerful thing. So, as you all know, if you're art makers or you create things at work, we put a piece of ourselves in our work always. And as an art therapist and an artist, I know that my story, my journey, my opinions, my passions, all of those things tend to come out in my work, even when that's unintentional or even if I don't want them to. It's a really beautiful thing. And so for me, as I grew into adulthood and into my professional career, the object of my anxiety began to change. So when we're thinking about a teen, typically teenage years is when anxiety and depression starts to come up. As a teen, what are we anxious about? Our looks, our body, being cool, think about sex, all of that kind of stuff. But I don't mean to diminish those things because those feel like very real issues while they're happening, but as adults, we aren't focused on that as much anymore. That anxiety starts to change a little bit because being cool and how we look isn't really tied to who we are as people anymore. They don't define our identity. But other things do, right? In our 30s, we use our relationships, our financial status, our job title, our education to be sort of indicators of who we are as people. We use those things to define who we are. And so for me, as I grew into adulthood, my anxiety began to attach itself to my performance at work and the approval of my mentors. And I became anxious. I became excessively worried, jittery, nauseous when I was at work and when I was thinking about work, which was constantly, because that's sort of the nature of the disorder, right? It doesn't leave you. You can't turn it off. And so now I had moved beyond being this anxious teen that was worried excessively about my weight and looking like this outsider that I felt other people could recognize. And I moved into being a very anxious adult woman who was worried excessively about her ability to do her job well. And everything terrified me. And, maybe terrified isn't the right word. Everything sent me into a panic. Everything made me sick. And so throughout my clinical internships and my first positions as a therapist, my productivity started to go down. I wasn't completing projects. I was missing work. I was losing jobs. I was saying no to opportunities that I should have said yes to, all because my anxious brain convinced me that I was an incapable fraud and I wasn't worthy of that position. So at the time, I sort of thought, I'm just a perfectionist. I'm just an overachiever. But in reality, I wasn't really achieving anything because I was too busy throwing up in a bathroom to even show up to things. And my supervisors started to perceive this inability to show up as disinterest, when in reality I was too interested. I was too invested in what was going on. I needed to turn it down a little bit. And so now, in addition to being anxious about not doing my job perfectly, I was anxious about my supervisors seeing me as disinterested. So you can see how this starts to turn into a vicious cycle. And one thing that you might notice in this story is this emphasis that I was placing on the perception of other people. The way that my brain convinced me that not only do I know what other people are thinking, I can tell what you're thinking, but my worth as a human being depends on that. That's really dangerous because both of those things are absolutely false. So what I needed to do was figure out what was helpful for me. And as I already had explained, showing up and taking action were really difficult because I was frozen by this possibility of not doing things perfectly. So instead, I chose to be pretty intentional and pretty passive about this. And all I did was begin to take notice of things that helped me to feel less anxious and things that prevented me from becoming more anxious. And one of those things was to take care of myself first. So when I got home from work, I was activated in this anxiety. I was freaking out. I would turn my phone off, right? You don't need to look at emails when you're not at work. Put it to the side. And I asked my body what it needed. And then second, I actually listened to what it told me. So some days that meant that I would sit on the floor for 20 minutes and not do anything, right? Some days I would go out and take a really long drive. Other days I would clean my refrigerator, or I would just go to sleep. And instead of feeding into that message that you're failing at this, I was gentle with myself, the way that I'm gentle with my clients. The second thing I did was I chose to spend time with people who helped me to feel less anxious. I chose to spend time with people that made me feel less anxious. So those are people that inspired me and accepted me and actually listened to me when I talked. So if we can return to the art here, these are my art journals, a few of them. And I don't work in these every day, but I do work in them when I need to. Because when I'm creating art, I feel present. I can't think of anything else except what I'm doing, so I'm taking those negative messages and putting them to the side. I know that art is tactile, so it brings me back into the room, right? I'm using my hands and senses. It's called grounding. Art making is repetitive. It requires a great deal of focus, so in that way it was really soothing to me. And art making helped me to feel confident or masterful. It gave me a sense of purpose. And then most importantly, it gave me some practice completing projects, which was something that was really hard at work. And the more that I practiced these rituals of listening to my body, of being vulnerable with people that I trusted, and self-soothing through art, the less that I was beating myself up for feeling anxious, and the easier it became then to handle those feelings of panic. Work was still an incredibly difficult environment to me, but it became manageable when I addressed that anxiety. I quit ignoring it, and I quit using it as a reason to speak harshly to myself. So although I still battle a number of anxieties, I know that it is okay to feel anxious. And I'm really proud of myself for validating that experience and naming it, and also taking some small steps to improve. Because when we recognize that something is wrong in our life, it's really important to ask, what am I doing about that? I think it's really easy for us to sort of just sit in that nasty feeling and say, oh, woe is me, all this kind of stuff. But what's most important is to ask, again, what am I doing about this? How can I help myself? Or if things are really bad, what am I able to do right now in this moment? What can I do? So in that way, I started to shift this emphasis from the perception of others, and I began to focus it inward. And I encourage you to do the same thing. I encourage you to listen to the messages that your body tells you, and also the messages that are coming out in your work. Allow your artwork, whether that's work art, play art, anxiety art, breakup art, whatever it is, to help cue you into what you need and cue you into what you're thinking about. I encourage you to notice and be curious and look really closely at the choices that you're making and the things that you're creating. and be gentle with yourself and allow yourself to improve. Because as art makers, we are a very special kind of person. We see beauty that other people don't see. We think more abstractly and more deeply, maybe that's me being arrogant, but we are able to read a different language. We can read metaphorical language, visual language, and not everybody can get in touch with that. So today, I am encouraging you to use that unique knowledge to your advantage. Use that knowledge to express yourself, communicate your ideas, and continue learning about who you are as a person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess. We have a bit of time for some questions. I do want to say, too, that Jess very graciously put out a little comment email list. So if you don't feel comfortable asking a question in front of everyone, feel free to put your name and email address on it, and you can reach out to her directly. So I guess I'll start. What kind of tips do you have for people who are feeling incredibly anxious in the moment while they're at work, and there's no escape route? Like you don't really have a chance to get to leave somewhere, so you've got to focus your energy and become less anxious pretty quickly. Are there any good?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's something that a lot of people sort of ask is, what happens if I start having this anxiety response and I'm in a situation where I can't leave, right? I'm with little kids, I'm at the grocery store, I'm at work. What do I do about that? And, that is going to be those really small steps to figuring out what's helpful for you. So for some folks, that might be a little bit of a mantra that you're repeating over and over. For some folks, that might be shifting your focus to doing something else, or maybe carrying around a visual journal like I do. When I know that I start flipping out, this is sort of my safe space, and this is something I know that I can rely on.
Who else has questions?
Like social media has been criticized for causing or triggering depression. Have you had positive or negative experiences with either yourself or your clients?
With social media specifically?
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of been interesting. I think, social media and also just everything that's going on in the world has created this huge upswing now of people entering into counseling because they're feeling really overwhelmed by the fact that they don't have a lot of control over what's going on or how they're being perceived by other people. And we know that sort of those algorithms on Facebook, too, are just pushing all of this stuff to make us feel like, everybody else is doing all this fun stuff and I'm not. So, unfortunately, I think that can be something that can contribute that and trigger that anxiety. And sometimes with my clients, what I ask them to do is make sure that you're not hopping on Facebook right before you're going to sleep. So we might decide at a good time, maybe 8 o'clock, to just get off that phone, get off that computer, and make sure that that's not something that's influencing you. On the other hand, that's not always a bad thing. A lot of folks are sort of using social media to, again, promote some of that self-confidence by posting their artwork online or reaching out to other people that are using art in a positive way. So it's a balance. Yeah, so typically this is going to change depending on the type of art therapist, but the place that I studied, there was a big emphasis on using whatever materials are available, so I try not to be picky. Typically what we do is we have watercolor paint, acrylic paint, oil pastels, and collage materials. That's sort of the base of what we use.
When it comes to doing art as your profession and then using it as a tool to express your anxiety, I've found that that's been really hard to separate the two.
Yes.
Can you speak on that at all?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of funny when folks first come into art therapy that are not comfortable with art, they tend to be like, oh, geez, what do I do? But then are able to click into that very quickly. If I have somebody that's coming into art therapy that is pretty good at doing art and they're used to doing art, it's much more difficult for them to start setting those things aside as far as what is my product going to look like, am I doing this right, all of that kind of stuff. And I mean, if you're an art maker, you know that might be a good exercise for you, right? If you're creating art that has nothing to do with work, try to see if you can do some stuff with your eyes closed, see if you can do something in the dark, do something, I'm going to draw for 30 seconds and set an alarm, and I'm not going to allow any negative messages to come in, right? So it's almost like you're relearning to do art in a way that's not technical.
How do you get engaged? So when somebody needs a therapist, like what's the engagement process for your clients to come into an art therapist versus traditional? So that's something I'm most curious about.
Yeah, so unfortunately there are very few art therapy resources in West Michigan. Over on the east side of the state, we have a few more. I work within a residential facility, so that art therapy is built into their programming. However, it's really my responsibility to reach out to the community and find those spaces that I can fill with art therapy and go to somebody and say, you know what, it really seems like your clients may benefit from art therapy. I understand that you might not know what that is, but let me explain that to you.
How does anxiety differ for people who are queer entering into space, people of color, and can you speak on that a little bit?
Absolutely.
In terms of maybe getting friends of color who you work with, or as a creative, oftentimes spaces are very white.
Mm-hmm.
When you look around, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do people of color like to manage those spaces through the anxiety that they have?
I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's a really good distinction. I think we've got a separate set of anxieties that are going to be present for folks that are feeling as though they're not included in the conversation. And being able to be in a space where you are comfortable to start talking about those things and bring those up is going to be really important. That not only is the responsibility of that client, but it's also the responsibility of the community in which that person is healing. So maybe the group, if it's a group therapy, or the facility in which they're going, to encourage those kinds of conversations to start happening and to say, I'm feeling anxieties that other people aren't, and I want to talk about it, and I want other people to know about it.
As a follow-up question to that, it's tough to have those conversations and even just say, hey, I'm anxious being in this space, because a lot of people don't necessarily have the level of consciousness or intuition to just in the open ear to see that person's side. So how do you, what advice do you give to the people on the other end if someone says, hey, I don't really feel comfortable here because they don't necessarily see your side?
I think one of the most important things that I've learned is that you can never, ever assume that you understand the experience of somebody else. Even if somebody is saying, I'm feeling really anxious, we can't say, oh, yeah, I know what that feels like. I've been there too, right? And being able to allow that person to completely tell you what that experience is like for them, what those barriers are for them, why this has been difficult in the past, and listening to what those reasons are, I think is really important, as opposed to just jumping in there and just saying, oh, sure, I understand what's going on. Does that make sense?
What sort of advice might you give for somebody managing an employee that has extreme anxiety, and what can help essentially what you help?
Yeah, I mean, that's really tough. I mean, it's sort of hard when this is an employee, because that's not really like an open dialogue that you can constantly be having with that person. It's not really professional. So, I think just having a very short conversation about, what can I expect? What are those things that are going to cue me into knowing that you need some help? And then can we both figure out a way that would be comfortable for you to go do that? So whether if it's, that person needs to go take a walk around the block, I'm saying that that's okay as your supervisor, or, when Sally starts to get really jittery in the meeting, that's letting me know that she's feeling anxious. So even if you're not doing anything about it, you're aware of it, and then maybe that's a conversation you can have down the line if those things continue to get worse. But it's really the responsibility of that person to start figuring out some things on their own and bring those practices into work so it's not impacting the entire workspace.
So I know a huge barrier for a lot of people with therapy that are in music therapy particularly is being able to afford it.
Yes.
A lot of healthcare doesn't really cover outpatient psychological services. So what are some resources that you know of for people who are seeking out therapy?
Yeah, I know that therapy can be an incredibly expensive thing. There are plenty of therapists, though, that work on a sliding scale, so that helps to make things a little bit more affordable. And actually, most clinicians, if you're going to see an individual clinician, typically has some sort of sliding scale. So that might start at around $30 or $40 per session. And, just say to somebody, I would love to, have these services from you, but I'm not able to afford them. Can we either figure something out, or can you refer me somewhere else? Yep, absolutely, yeah. So an average day in art therapy, we sort of come in, we do a warm-up exercise where we're just doodling. We do that for about 15 minutes. Then everybody goes around the room. We do a little bit of a check-in. After that, we typically have a conversation. So I work in addiction treatment, so we're talking about things like triggers, coping skills, all of that kind of stuff. Tell me how that's going for you. And then we have what's called a directive in art therapy that takes up the majority of that session. So, we would explain it for about 15 minutes, and then that person would engage in art making for about an hour or an hour and a half. After that, the group or the individual has an opportunity to then share not only what they created, but what that experience was like for them. Sometimes we have folks that just, they're like, I couldn't really do it, or I couldn't make it today, and that's fine. I don't care what you're making, but tell me about what that was like for you when you had to sit in this space and do some art making.
Do you know of any companies or workplaces that are kind of leading the way on being proactive about anxiety in the workplace? Like we've seen the way that we treat mothers and our policy is a lot more proactive and empathetic now than it was.
Mm-hmm.
Is there kind of someone who's leading the way, or any hope that that's going to be kind of acknowledged and addressed, maybe even more on a widespread level?
There aren't any that I know of. Other folks maybe have some ideas about that. But I think just having this be something that we're talking about more often and more openly certainly helps to push that.
How do you deal with your clients who think you're not really to get them started? They think they're going to do art and they kind of got it before.
So that's sort of one of my main goals as an art therapist, because I have probably 90% of the people coming in saying, like, this is dumb, what am I doing? So I start to approach it more as a playfulness thing, right? So if, I haven't done this since I was a kid, or I haven't done this since, I was doing this with my kids, then let's be kids today. Let's be weird. Let's be playful and see what we can learn from that. When's the last time that you were playful? When's the last time that you were able to let go and do those kinds of things? What is that experience like for you? So just sort of leads into a second conversation about that person's resistance or their rigidity, or what that is really preventing them from just doing whatever. There's no pressure in these sessions. So what's the deal? Why don't you want to do this with me today?
How does art therapy work in group setting versus individual?
So a group setting is going to be a lot different than an individual session, because we have to make sure that everybody is seen and heard in that space. Those individual art therapy sessions are going to be driven a lot more by projects. So people might have something that they're working on for 2, 4, 6 weeks. But with an art or with a group session, we might have new members that are coming to the group each week. So that's sort of my challenge, to present that over and over again. And it's much more community-based, much more sharing with other people, listening to other people, and learning from other people in a group setting, as opposed to an individual session where you're just focused on yourself.
I was wondering about the role of medication in therapy, and if someone with extreme anxiety is on a kind of medication, how the role changes.
Yeah, the reason I'm hesitating is, like I said, I'm in addiction work right now, so that's a really weird thing to navigate for folks that are newly sober or trying to navigate that sober life. But we know that anxiety and depression can be alleviated a great deal by medication. So it's going to be my job to maybe introduce that to a client, right? Have you thought about taking any meds before? What has that been like for you if you have? And then if not, I wonder what the pros and cons would be to exploring that and maybe helping that person set up a psychiatrist appointment and then sort of monitoring what's going on. You've been on your meds for about 4 weeks now. That's about when things start to kick into place. How are you feeling? Are you feeling better? You want to get off them? All that kind of stuff. So those things can really partner up.
You talked about the separation on the artist side. How about you? Can you look around this gallery and enjoy it as just a layperson, or do you psychoanalyze everything?
I can't know. I know, and I think I have a problem with that too, like in my personal life, like every once in a while, like my boyfriend will be like, stop psychoanalyzing me. But it's important, I think I try to at least sort of set that aside. And like I said, nobody can explain to me what's going on in that image except the person that created it. So it's not like I'm walking around being like, oh, that person's this and this person's feeling that. It might make me curious, like, wow, I wonder, what this person was thinking when they made this, or I would love to have a conversation with this person. It seems like they have this theme in their work. How great. But I try to make sure it doesn't go past that at all.
All right. I think that's it. So thank you so much, Jess.
You're welcome.